Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 4 of our podcast titled Expressly Speaking. Once again, I'm your co-host, Aaron Katarik from the Honolulu Star Advertiser and Oahu Publications in beautiful Hawaii. And I'm joined again by my co-host, Jim Smith, the National Sales Director for the Steel City Corporation in equally beautiful Ashland, Ohio. And today we have a very special guest, a good friend of mine in the industry, Pete Doucette from FTI Consulting. We'll get to Pete here shortly. But as you know, by watching or listening to the first 3 episodes of Expressly Speaking, Jim and I always have a special Zoom background that we would like to discuss and how this particular background has been instrumental to our career. So Jim, over to you. It looks like you are actually at the Steel City Corporation.
Good day, gents. So if you watched episode 3, you knew that I had a picture of the original Steel City Corporation at 190 North Meridian in Youngstown, Ohio. And it was a 1930s industrial looking manufacturing facility, lots of dark colors and kind of drab. And now when we moved to Ashland, Ohio a few years ago, since Aaron described it as so beautiful, we had to fit in with the environment. So now we're in a lime green building in Ashland, Ohio. But the story behind this is kind of interesting. You can't tell from this picture, but in behind me on the other side of the parking lot this was a abandoned shopping center that a big box store had come into and driven some local stores out of, and a small restaurant, a small grocery store. And then the big box store moved across town and built a bigger box store. And so this was an empty grounds. So our ownership group came in and bought the entire property. And basically we've reconfigured this entire campus. I like to call it the world headquarters of Steel City Corp. And we reconfigured this entire campus to basically be a mixed manufacturing and office complex. So we're pretty popular in Ashland because of that, because we took a kind of eyesore at the south end of town and spruced it up, and obviously brought some bright colors. And as you like to see there, the sun always shines on Steel City. So there you go. Aaron, tell us about the record.
Well, I am standing at 530 East Market Street in beautiful downtown Stockton, California, in front of the Record newspaper, a newspaper that I started working at in 2002 when I made the leap of faith all the way from the Atlantic Ocean, moving from Savannah, Georgia to the Pacific Ocean, Stockton, California. And I was told by the late, great Rich Randalls, I'm hoping our listeners remember Rich Randalls. He gave me some great advice. He said, I guarantee you, if you make the move to California, and you can make a name for yourself in the media scene in the great state of California, one of the most competitive media states in the union, it will jumpstart your career. And I took his advice, and I really thank Rich for giving me this wonderful advice, because my time in Stockton, California was wonderful. Started with the Omaha World Herald Company, was the owner, then sold to Dow Jones Local Media Group. Spent a good 4 years there, and I really enjoyed working for Roger Coover, the publisher there. But another gentleman who's near and dear to my heart that is associated with the Record was our corporate vice president of circulation for Dow Jones, Don Waterman, who I know, Pete, you know very well. Don was another mentor in my career, and I met him when we were purchased by Dow Jones. So there is my story on Stockton. So with that said, let's get to our esteemed guest, Pete Doucette. For those of you who may not know, Pete is the managing director of technology, media, and telecom at FTI Consulting. Before that, he worked at the Boston Globe as the vice president of audience/consumer revenue, and was the chief consumer officer. And the Boston Globe is one of the great newspapers in our nation. So Pete, another few things that I'd like to say about him is he's really an expert on the digital subscription economy. He's one of the pioneers. He's an expert when it comes down to driving consumer revenue and optimizing subscription revenue. And I am just thrilled that we have him as a guest here. So Pete, welcome to Expressly Speaking.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here. I was going to say, I wish I had my background. You know, I just have my home office here, but we could have thrown the globe, you know, it would have been 135 Morrissey Boulevard in Dorchester, and you would have seen the Boston Globe background. But I guess if I ever get lucky enough to come back, I'll have the backdrop ready to go.
Well,
awesome.
And Jim, you know, we got to make sure all of our guests are aware that we're going to have a background, and they should have one too. So that's a good tip for us, Pete.
I think I just got a homework assignment.
Yeah, there you go. So Pete, FTI Consulting, you know, I know a little bit about FTI because my parent company, Black Press, has done some work with FTI. But for our listeners, just a brief overview of who FTI is, what they do, your role there, and how you specifically help your clients solve their issues through your consult.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. So I wish I could look out to the audience and say, raise your hand if you've heard of FTI Consulting. Because, you know, even without being able to see them, there's not a lot of hands up, and that's because most people don't know a lot about FTI. So appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about it. So we're like a global management consulting firm. We've got about like 5,000 employees all around the world. And, you know, I work in what's called the technology, media, and telecom practice. And a subset of that is what we call publishing and digital media. So the publishing and digital media team focuses on newspaper publishers, magazine publishers, digital native publishers, particularly around, you know, what we call business transformation or you know, digital transformation. And really, you know, the whole media industry is really disrupted. I think everyone listening to this podcast, I'm sure, can relate to that. And so what we do is try and help our clients through transformation. And, you know, that starts with like strategy, like where are you today? Where are you trying to get to? What does that future model look like? And so I've done a lot of work in the last few years since I've been with FTI, working with, particularly with newspaper publishers and magazine publishers to some extent, around building that kind of strategic roadmap and helping them get through, you know, thinking about the legacy business. It might be print, it might be advertising. How do we tweak the business and build a roadmap ultimately to get to a sustainable future? And so I spend most of my time thinking about how to help publishers solve the question of sustainability.
Excellent.
Pete, I watched years ago when you were at the Globe, I mentioned this earlier, that you gave a presentation prior to my presentation in a fall conference there. But when I was looking back, I went back and looked at today, and what you might not recall, but the title was a case study to drive business growth through experimentation. And what caught my eye was the experimentation word. And you had a lot of slides about a lot of things you had tried. So is that key to the whole concept of experimenting, you know, studying, doing case studies, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, Jim. And what I'd say is, you know, the most important thing is nobody really knows what the exact path looks like. I think there's a lot of different ways to kind of like squint at the horizon and say like, our future is going to look like this. And, you know, we have a general direction, but it's really, really hard / impossible to get, you know, kind of the exact blueprint. You have a lot of different plans and strategies to get there. And so the point about that presentation and experimenting is you've got to try things and you got to try different things and you have to make bets. And so what you want to do is make educated bets. You want to build an organization that can try things, learn, and try again and again and again. Because if I were to, you know, if someone were to ask me like, what are some of the success factors that separate companies that do it well and the ones that are struggling? It's the ones that can do that experimentation, can try things, and can move faster. And the other thing I like to say about experimenting is, you know, each experiment itself can be like a small thing, but and they're not all going to work. And so I think sometimes people get frustrated because they think everything's supposed to work. That's not you're not testing the right things if everything works, right? And I like to think about, there's like a baseball analogy. I think about like kind of the batting average. You want to be batting, 250, 300, 350, just like you were trying to be like a number 3 or number 4 hitter in the lineup. So if you're getting success at that level, then you're doing things to kind of progress you on that transformation path.
We referenced that on other calls with some of our previous guests, and that was just failing cheap, failing fast, taking risks, stepping on the field, getting between the lines. So I really like that analogy, and I think more people just need to be, less risk averse. But the first topic I wanted to talk about is, digital subscriber price optimization. So earlier in the year, our great friends at Mather Economics came out with a white paper, and I'm just going to take a peek at some of the statistics that came out from that white paper. So they mentioned that basically 17% of all volumes on average from a newspaper come from digital units, but only about 6.9% of the total revenues for an audience department come from digital units of audience. So there's a gap there. So that the gap means to me, one, that newspapers aren't charging enough for digital platforms, digital usage, et cetera. And 7% right now, that's just not enough revenue to get us where we're going in terms of paying for the infrastructure we need to gather news and information. So you want to talk a little bit about that gap, and also what we need to do as media executives to increase not only the volume, but the revenue, because we know print volumes are declining 10%, year over year.
Right. No, it's a good point. So a couple of thoughts there. One is, I'd say as a general theme, if we want to talk about digital pricing, from my vantage point, publishers, and this is a general statement, undercharge for their content. They just do. And I've looked at, I've got a benchmark data set of like 200 US newspapers. And I think the average, in terms of the pricing, if you look at all across these 200 publishers, is a little bit below $10 a month. And to your point, Aaron, it's really hard to build a business with subscribers that in print might be paying 30, 35, 40, 45, $50 a month or up, and then transitioning some of them to paying like $9 a month. The economics don't really balance out. So my first kind of theme would be publishers need to have confidence in pricing and try and price more. And what gives me confidence with that statement is we've worked with a lot of publishers. We did a program with the Google News Initiative last year, and we worked with some of their publishers on their digital subscription pricing. And without saying specifically who they are, I can say a couple of them had a price point of $9.99 per month for digital. And so we had them test $14.99 per month for a digital subscription. So it's a 50% price increase. And the two publishers that did that saw, it was less than like 3%, like 2% incremental churn. So the lesson there is you can price higher, and these are smaller publishers, and people will pay for that. So first lesson is you got to charge more. The second thing is you have to aggressively pursue digital subscriptions, and there's all kinds of ways to improve conversion and things like that. I agree with you. Where the revenue is trailing the volume's not moving fast enough to keep up with the print declines, I think is kind of your point. So where I see happening is over the next, pick it 5 years, as publishers are eliminating days a week printing, McClatchy eliminated Saturdays. I see, like, when I squint at the horizon, I see Sunday plus digital for the US market is going to be the place where where publishers are kind of moving towards. They're all taking different paths. Going back to our conversation about experiments, they're taking like maybe different paths to get there. But I think that that's where most, we'll say, metro or small metro publishers in the US are going to be, call it 5 years from now. And what I think is important then is to get your Sunday plus digital price as high as you can, and then you can preserve that, and then down the road after that, eventually you'll become a digital publisher when the printing economics don't work. And, so it's a long answer to your question, but I think you got to get more aggressive on pricing, got to think about how do you convert more, and we can talk more about that. And then I think you got to think about not doing it right away. It's kind of a timeline. There's probably steps in that journey, if that makes sense.
So Pete, you just used in your answer there, you had the statement, aggressively pursue digital subscriptions. And I read your digital subscription playbook as well that your collaborative published. And the line in there is also aggressively embrace digital subscriptions. So I'm interested in your perspective on pursuing is one thing, but I think you have to embrace it first, perhaps, and what that statement means per se.
Yeah, there's no doubt. You can't go down a path if you're not like sure of where you're going, right? So when we wrote like embrace it, to me it's kind of like a mindset. And so I mean, I'm a consultant. We use all kinds of frameworks to explain things, and my favorite framework of all is a 2x2 matrix. And you think about the quadrants, and with what I mean by that is, historically newspaper publishers were print centric and advertising centric. And what we're trying to say is over time, over the long run, they're likely to become digital centric and consumer centric. And so it's moving from the lower left to the upper right. And so in order to make that shift from the lower left to the upper right, you have to embrace the mindset of what it is to change and think like you need to think like a subscription or consumer company. And that's different than thinking like an ad company or like a manufacturing and a distribution company. And so it's really starts with having kind of a goal of where you're going, and then building kind of the organization around it to pursue that and get charged. And once you start, I've seen publishers that have set that goal and have made progress. You build momentum, I guess is my point. So, you take some steps, you see some early wins, you build momentum, and then the organization embraces that. So you got to have the mindset. And then once you're clear on that path, you got to pursue it vigorously, because that's the only other point I want to make is time is not on the side of publishers. And if I have a few hopefully pearls of wisdom, I want publishers to move faster. And that's like, you can't expect it, just to do things incrementally. You gotta move quicker.
Yeah, so real quick back on pricing, you mentioned publishers just aren't charging enough for digital subscriptions, and we all know that because Jim and I actually have a game that we're always trying to find the lowest digital subscription rate out there. We find all sorts of, we found one 8 cents a week recently, $1 for 6 months. And I'm all for having a wide funnel, and I'm all for casting a wide net. But I just can't see how you move people up the ladder off those lucrative rates without realizing massive amounts of churn. What's your thought on those low rates? I personally, here's my thoughts, and then I'll let you give yours.
Sure.
Publishers are not charging for content, they're charging by platform. And to me, that's a big no-no. I think the content has the same value no matter which platform it resides on, whether that be print or digital platform. And I think newspapers need to do a better job of, hey, I understand subscribers are probably going to pay anywhere from $25 to $30 per month for an all-access print and digital subscription. I think your digital price point should be no less than 70% of that rate. That's my personal opinion, and that's how we price digital subscriptions here. But what's your take on this?
Yeah, no, I think fundamentally you're correct. What you're buying is content and access to the newsroom. I think, if you were to start it over again, I could see there'd be like a subscription, like a content subscription price. And then maybe with home delivery, you might charge like a delivery charge or whatever. And it's reframing, what you're actually buying, right? but that's not how the industry evolved. And so we're kind of in this different place. In terms of like the aggressive promotional offers, I think they can work in certain circumstances, but that's for what I would call mature publishers. So if you've been at it for 10 years and you have this large base of digital subscribers, and maybe your digital subscription revenue is 50% and not the 7% that you talked about, then you can do some things like that because you're really getting into like price segmentation. The mistake I see publishers make, and this is, I think, your point, Aaron, is most of the publishers are doing it now when they have a tiny bit of revenue, and in their most likely subscribers are still there. You need to price them aggressively. When I say aggressively, like high price aggressively, not low price aggressively. And so I think it's a big mistake to try and give your content away and build it up with a high volume. And I don't think you can get there. So you need to build up a sizable base before you get into like those high promotional discounts. And I'd say 99% of the industry is not in a place to do that.
So a few months back, there was an article written by an Irish Chi. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Chyi. She is a professor at the journalism school at the University of Texas. Do you recall that article she wrote? She was really, I think she took about 40 United States newspapers and looked at the amount of total volume those newspapers had in comparison to how many digital subscriptions they had. And it was an eye-opener for me. But she made reference to ramen noodles theory, and I just like to read this. She says that digital has always been viewed by readers as an inferior good, calling it the ramen noodles theory. Since digital subscriptions are typically cheaper than print subscriptions, she says consumers perceive less value. It's the same way that ramen noodles are cheaper than steak. They're also less satisfying. I mean, that really puts things into perspective for me. And I think that goes along the lines about what you were referencing earlier, that we just don't charge enough. And since we don't, the content is perceived to have less value than something in a printed product, even though it's the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think playing off that, I think at some level perception becomes reality, right? So if it's perceived cheaper, then if it's charged at a lower rate and it's perceived cheaper, then it becomes self-fulfilling. And so, but I think 2 points I want to make about that is, one is I was talking with yesterday with a publisher in Denmark, and their effective rate equivalent in US dollars for subscriptions is $40 a month.
Wow.
And that's what they're yielding, that's not their advertised rate, that's what they're yielding. And the reason I bring it up is you can get, so there, Denmark's a different country, the economics are different, the ad market's a little bit different, so I'm not saying it's perfectly analogous, but they've built up, and they've gone for premium price versus volume, going back to what we were just saying. And so my point is, it can be done. It's all how you frame it in the mind of the consumer, which I think gets back to the steak versus ramen noodles. So I'm pro steak, so I was hoping we can find a way to get there. So it's just, to me, there is a way to do it, but we need to think about it differently. And I think the way that publishers have thought about it to date is it's just a little bit backwards.
So I have a follow-up to that, because I see a lot of offers, and Aaron mentioned we kind of share these offers when we find them. And I don't need to know specific names and locations, but it almost seems like, here we go, the cat's out of the bag. They've been offering these 8 cents a week, 99 cents, 6 months. Is everybody being the aggressive to the high? Is anyone, I should say, being the aggressive to the higher end out of the gate, as opposed to trying to catch up later? Here in the States, I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, no, I mean, the best example I can give is probably the Globe. I used to work at the
Right.
Globe, and I forget, I'm losing track of time, but I want to say in like 2016, maybe, we made the shift. When the Globe launched digital subscriptions in 2011, the price at that point was $16 a month, which was high at that time, higher than what we're talking about now, and high, it's certainly at that time. And that was where it was over time. And then a few years passed, they transitioned to what's was 99 cents a day, or about 30 bucks a month. And so I think they're on the definitely on the higher end. And so that was a very conscious choice to say, what's our potential base of subscribers volume? What's the maximum price we can charge? And then use that to kind of inform the pricing strategy. So there's a few that I see that are like the $20 per month, very few in the 20 to 30, not much higher than that. But there are some examples, and even some small publishers we've worked at had, I think one was at $22 a month. I know another one that was at $27 a month. So they don't get as much press maybe, but I think they're going, to Aaron's point, they're charging for content and newsroom access, and some of them have parity between print and digital. You just subscribe, become a subscriber, whatever package you want.
So could we just talk a little bit more about Europe? You mentioned your client in Denmark, and I know you have access to a lot of publishers in Europe. I know Matt Lindsay does a lot of work over in Europe, and we're going to have him on a guest here soon. So it'll be interesting to hear your comments versus his. But, what can we learn from these digital publishers in Europe? Pete, you and I sit on the INMA North America board, and we hear a lot about Aftenposten and Dagens Nyheter and some of these other newspapers. But what can we learn from them that we can actually execute here on our continent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'd say the European markets are all very different. So there's the Nordics, which are very advanced with digital subscriptions. The UK is very different because it's a very newsstand-centric model. And then the kind of mainland, like I was talking about, Denmark, has less legacy kind of print advertising. So they focus a lot more on subscription. So Europe itself is a little bit diverse. But if you take the Nordics, or maybe like the Danish publisher that I was talking about, I think what you can learn is, one, they've been more progressive and aligning the newsroom and the business side around a common goal of digital subscriptions. So there's a noticeable difference in talking with some European publishers versus some US publishers, where there's still more church and state and things like that. And from my perspective, while the church and state served its purpose over time, I think where publishers are today, they need an integrated strategy where the entire organization is clear on where they're going and they're all working towards that. And that includes the journalists. And I'm not saying you're writing, in a certain way. It's just they need to understand the economics of their business and how it all connects together, and things like that. So
can I stop you for a second? That is a brilliant take that I 110% agree with, by the way, that we need to come together. I understand church and state, but there's a certain level of profitability we need to maintain. There's a certain level of content gathering that we need to execute, and there's a price that costs, and having everyone in one's organization understand what things cost and a certain level of profitability we need to maintain is powerful. So sorry to interrupt, but I really agree with that statement.
No, it's good. I see it all the time. And you can't have a newsroom going over here and covering, certain things. And to your point, there's the economics of content and how it all fits together. It all needs to be integrated. And so I think that's a big learning that I think the European markets are further advanced in the integrations between the business side and the news side. And I would say the other thing is, it's maybe, and this is like a softer thing, but it's kind of a mindset thing too. We're talking about, aggressively embrace and pursue. I think that they have more commitment towards a future model where I think US publishers are struggling to see what that looks like. So they just kind of stay doing what they know. And I know that's kind of a broad statement, but it's definitely the mindset thing. There's all the other specifics in terms of like marketing mechanics and things like that. But I think it's those bigger things that cause some of the separation in performance.
Well, it's interesting, and this may tie in a little bit. I'm not sure, but in that playbook that you have, you talk about the maturity curve, right? And you have what's technology, process, people, strategic direction, right? And then groups are identified as lagging, gaining, chasing, leading, kind of, as they move up. So I hope this doesn't put you on the spot, but I'm just wondering if you compared to Europe and some of the examples you gave, if you had to grade where we are, and it's a big general statement, I know, in the U.S., where are we? What's our median here? Are we lagging? Are we gaining? Are we chasing?
We're lagging. And I mean, I'm trying to be as honest as I can. I just think that, but I see progress and I see improvement, but it's just, we're not, I would talk a little bit about moving quicker. I just think we're not moving that fast. And I think the other thing, so not to go too far on a tangent, I think our ownership structure is a little bit different here than it is in Europe. So that plays into it. So it's certainly harder with some of the chain dynamics and public companies versus private companies. So that's important. So I don't want to diminish that, but we're still really, really early in the process. We're still just starting to get our head around turning the battleship and trying to move in a different direction. Even though publishers have been at it for 10 years or whatever, they haven't really been committed to it for 10 years. They've been maybe committed to it in the last year or two. And COVID, the bad side of the COVID pandemic is, we all know the impact that it's had on ad revenue, particularly print revenue. The good side of it, from my perspective, is it a catalyst to help publishers say, okay, the print runway is looking different from my business. I need to move quicker. I need to embrace like new ideas and new business model. So I'm hopeful, and I'm seeing a little bit of that. This is a catalyst for change. I think that's going to be really big.
So for our listeners, first and foremost, they need to go to FTI's website. I'm going to plug your company, Pete, and download the digital subscriptions playbook. A, it's free, and B, it's loaded with unbelievable information. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I've read it numerous times. And, what we've recently been talking about here is the maturity curve. And you mentioned lagging. So I just want to talk about some of the attributes of a lagging organization when it comes to digital subscribers as laid out in the digital subscriptions playbook. Primarily print focused, limited digital subscription skill sets, remains print organization, tension between priorities, undeveloped analytics and testing, tech stack that consists of disparate systems. So I urge you to go and take a look at that on page 8, lagging, gaining, chasing, leading, best in class. I hope at some point we can move up the ladder here and get toward being leading organizations in the digital subscription space. But as Pete mentioned, we are just not there. As a consumer of news and advertising information, me personally, Aaron J. Katarik, I subscribe to a lot of different subscriptions. And like many out there, I'm getting a little bit of subscription fatigue, whether that's all these magazines I subscribe to, newspapers, other subscription services like Amazon, Spotify, Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Apple TV. I have so many subscriptions that I'm just starting to be fatigued by everything. So can you talk a little bit about subscription fatigue and what that term really means to you and how we can get around it moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's real. I mean, I subscribe to as many things as you, so I totally
probably more.
I actually have no idea how many subscriptions I have. I've lost track, and now there are apps that I can't remember what it's called, but can help you manage your subscriptions. I probably should subscribe to the app that helps me manage my subscriptions. I think it's that. So if I knew it, I would plug it. But yeah, I think in reality, we talk about video and Netflix and Hulu, and like there's a lot of choice. We went from everything was bundled, whether it's newspapers or TV was all bundled. Now everything's unbundled. So I think it's hard to manage. The flip side is it allows you to kind of find different segments and different users, and you can kind of relate with that. But I think the most important thing for local news publishers is to really differentiate their content and really focus on local. I know that sounds very commonsensical, if that's even a term, but I see them think like, you're not competing with the New York Times, you're not competing with the Washington Post. You need to be local, local, local. And if you are the stop for local news, better than the local TV stations or radio stations or public broadcasts or whatever, and if you can do that, then that is your sweet spot. And even despite all the Hulus and Spotify's and Amazon Primes of the world, because yes, you're competing with them for subscription dollars, but you're in a totally different space. People pay for what they really value, what they're passionate about, and what they, what is differentiated, or where your competitive advantage is. So I still think there's a space for that, despite all of these subscriptions going on. But like the flip side of that is, I've heard, the Apple News of the world, you aggregate them all into one spot, all the different newspapers into one spot. It kind of makes sense for a consumer because you can subscribe once, $10 a month or whatever it is, and then you can read everything. But it hasn't really worked either. It doesn't, the app, I think they've discontinued some of the Apple News Premium or whatever. So my point is, I think I wouldn't, as a publisher, don't get discouraged with subscription fatigue. You need to recognize it's going on. But when you like promote your offer and promote your subscription, focus on what's differentiated. It's really about not competing with everything else. It's about speaking to your consumers.
I'm watching the Virtual Highway webinar, and it's interesting because, over and over again, we're hearing about that local, kind of the old rat card, right? And the old vending machines, local, right? Yeah. And I'm not sure how many times they have to be reminded of that. The town I live in Kent, Ohio, I'm going to read Kent News, I hope, in my local paper or my local digital, edition or whatever the case may be. It's critical. It seems so, like you said, I'm going to steal that non-word. It seems so commonsensical.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. But sometimes you can get lost in thinking I have to cover everything. And so, which I get, but I think a publisher would be much better served if they picked 5 things that they covered really, really well. It might be like local town government. It could be high school sports, and it varies by market. But if you might be the food restaurant scene or whatever it is. If you just, I think where publishers have made mistakes is they have X number of journalists and they spread them too thin, and then they it's an inch deep and a mile wide, right? And you're not really going deep. And just you'd be much better served if you narrow your focus to those local things and just put more resources on those, because I think that's where then you're tapping into the foodies in your market and the high school parents for sports in the market and the local people in local politics. And that's how you make a difference. And so narrow focus, but go deeper.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I remember when I was working for Rufus Friday in Lexington, he used to say we have to be excellent at covering our niches. And our niches in Lexington are Kentucky Wildcat athletics, the coal industry, the Bourbon Trail, high school sports, and local city and county government. And no one can ever beat us to the punch at those. And as a resident of, central and eastern Kentucky, if the Herald Leader could provide you local, relevant, and differentiated information in those niche buckets, no one could provide better coverage than us in those niche buckets. And therefore, that would help with retention and acquisition. So I like what you said about being good at covering those local, relevant, and differentiated niches.
Yeah.
I want to go back to pricing a little bit. I was just thinking about our Wahoo Publications digital pricing. And if I have you on as a guest, I mean, I got to get a free consult here of some sort. No, but in all
Can I
seriousness,
send the bill afterwards?
yeah, you can send it to Jim Smith at the Steel City Corporation, care of the Lime Green Building.
We're easy to find.
But what about digital subscription pricing by geography? Now, we execute this strategy here, and I want to get your take on it. So when a subscriber comes in, wants to sign up for a digital subscription, we obviously know where they live based on their billing zip code. And their rate for a digital subscription is higher the closer to Honolulu you are. So if you're on Oahu, you pay $21.95 a month. If you're on one of the neighbor islands, you pay $15.95 a month. And if you're anywhere else on the planet, you pay $12.95 a month. Now, this was a strategy our president and publisher, Dennis Francis, and our CRO, Dave Kennedy, instituted back in 2010, and I love it. The closer you are to Honolulu, the more important that information is to you. Therefore, the more we charge you. Your take, Pete Doucette, on pricing by geo.
Yeah, it's interesting for sure. And at some level, my guess is that pricing strategy helps protect print too.
Correct.
Yeah. So where print is most relevant, Greater Honolulu area, Oahu, Waikiki, what my Hawaii geography is pretty limited.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I think it makes sense from where publishers are and managing the print migration. But I would offer a little bit of a counter viewpoint.
Please do.
I'm also a believer that there's like a diaspora of like, just say people who grew up in Honolulu, then go live in LA or New York or Detroit or Stockton, California.
Yep, there is.
Yeah. And so if you have this connection to Hawaii and you live elsewhere and you want to maintain a connection and you want to know what's happening in your local community, or your family still lives there or whatever, I also have seen, and I believe that some of those people will actually pay more and not less.
True.
And so I think it's interesting to think about how you maximize the value of each potential user. And I could see it as print diminishes, and we're all at different kind of inflection points with print decline. But as print diminishes, I think you could almost see a differentiated pricing strategy where maybe the whole state of Hawaii becomes more uniform, and the out-of-market consumers who convert at a lower rate, but you find the ones that are maybe that diaspora, they might pay a higher price point. So over time, it may flip the other way, is my outside perspective.
Well, yeah, I appreciate the free advice, and I like the thoughts, because we could take it one step further, and you sign up for a subscription. We could ask, are you a former resident of Hawaii, or some questions like that, and the way they answer those questions determines their price point.
Yeah.
So
it's all about what you know about your customers, right?
Hope the folks controlling the rates in Manitowoc, Wisconsin aren't watching for Aaron's sake. He's going to pay so much for that subscription of his hometown paper.
Yeah.
Well, my parents are still alive and they still read it. So you got me as long as they're breathing. Well, I think we're pretty close to 45 minutes here, Pete. And I just wanted to thank you for the time, and thank FTI Consulting for all you do for the industry. I mean, once again, I'm telling all of our listeners, please go out and download the digital subscription playbook. It's one of the most powerful and valuable tools that you can have in your possession when it comes down to growing digital subscriptions, growing digital subscription revenue, retaining digital subscribers, and how not to be a laggard, and possibly how to move yourself into the gaining and chasing boxes on the maturity curve. So, Pete, this has been a wonderful 45 minutes. Jim, I'm going to throw it over to you for some closure.
Pete, I would say the same thing. I was fascinated. I did visit the website and did some little background trying to get a little grasp for today's session, and amazing data. I'm kind of a data nerd, so it was, I really enjoyed it. The white paper about the analysis of the financial crisis facing California, local data with the AB5 and all that stuff on the horizon, just breaking that down into, the actual effect of things like that, just great stuff. So thanks for spending time with us, and thanks for your efforts.
Yeah, thank you both. This has been a lot of fun. It's my first podcast, and so excited to do it.
Well, we appreciate your time. For
Absolutely.
those listening, episode 5, we will have another special guest, Matt Lindsay, the owner and founder of Mather Economics. I am sure we will hear some common themes from what we heard today from Pete, but it'll be interesting to hear the differences in opinion and philosophies, strategy and tactics from Pete to Matt. So next week, Matt Lindsay. Until then, I hope you enjoyed the best damn podcast in the land.
Thanks, guys.
Sounds like V.